Today's episode of Lone Star Lawyers on the Varsity Podcast Network is brought to you by Varsity Search. Varsity Search builds great teams by connecting lawyers in Texas with career opportunities at small and boutique law firms. So if you're thinking of making a move or your law firm is looking to hire, please go to varsitysearch.com and book a time to visit right into my calendar. Varsity Search, building great teams. Hey everyone, Daniel here back with you on Lone Star Lawyers. I hope you and your family are both healthy and safe. Before we get into this episode, I want to let you know that we are working with several law firms in Dallas for various litigation opportunities, as well as family law opportunities in both Tarrant and Harris counties. So if you or someone you know might have interest in any of these, please email me, daniel@varsitysearch.com, or go to varsitysearch.com/lawyers. All right, today we head to Houston, where our guest is Akilah Craig. Akilah is an associate in the labor and employment group at the AmLaw 200 firm Vorys. Akilah defends employers in state and federal court and administrative agencies on employment claims and counsels clients on a wide range of employment matters. Akilah is the vice chair of the Association of Women Attorneys Foundation, and she's on the board of directors for the Houston Young Lawyers Association. She has been a Texas Super Lawyers Rising Star since 2015 and was named a top 40 under 40 in Texas by the National Black Lawyers. All right, with that, let's hop into our conversation with Akilah Craig on today's Monday Mentors episode of Lone Star Lawyers. Akilah Craig joins us right now. Akilah, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to visit with you. And I gave a very brief introduction before we hopped on here. But for those listening, would you just share with us your practice, your firm, what you do, and tell us a little more about your work?
Sure. So I work at Vorys, which is a full-service firm based in Columbus, Ohio. We have offices across the Mid-Atlantic, D.C., obviously Houston, Texas, which is where I'm based. I'm a labor and employment attorney, and so I sort of provide day-to-day counseling to various businesses on their employment issues, whether that relates to policies and procedures, manager and employee training, employment and severance agreements, compliance with various state, local, and federal employment statutes. That's sort of my bread and butter. That's kind of what my day is spent emailing back and forth with various employers. But I also have a litigation side to my work as well. So we defend employers in both state and federal courts, and then before administrative agencies, sort of when the advice that we've given ends up, hitting the fan. That's when we'll also sort of on the back end deal with the litigation side of things too.
Yeah. So remind me and walk us through how and when did you get into the labor and employment side from the litigation kind of foundation, I think, that you had at the beginning of your career?
Absolutely. So, I started off, as you mentioned, as a straight commercial litigator. And then about 3 years ago, the opportunity to get into more of a hybrid practice came about, and that's actually when I switched over to Vorys. So they were looking for someone who had a litigation background, but who wanted to get more experience in labor and employment. So coming with a little bit of labor and employment, having done that at my prior firm, because when you do full service litigation, you sort of touch on various different areas of law. So kind of drinking from a fire hose for the first couple of months was just getting up to speed on various employment laws. And then over the past year or so, it's sort of almost transitioned away from just the traditional commercial litigation. So for the most part, my docket is going to be employment litigation across the country.
Yeah. And we're going to talk in just a minute about COVID and its impact, and I'm sure heavily on the labor and employment space as well, specifically. But beyond that, and maybe kind of rewinding back to January before COVID hit, was there anything, and is there anything still going on or happening within the labor and employment space that you were paying attention to, are still paying attention to, in terms of maybe either changes to the laws or rules, or just things that your clients were really trying to deal with that were maybe new, novel, or just kind of on your plate that were coming about?
I won't say there was anything particularly new, but the issues that we sort of were facing, or that my employers were facing, because we deal in sort of a multi-state practice. And so, especially when you have employers who are working across the 50 states. And so this came up a lot in the Me Too movement, which I can say was over the past 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
What ended up happening is a lot of the employers that I work with are now coming around with, all right, we want policies to make sure that we're not meeting the bare minimum. We want to meet sort of the highest standards that are available. Oftentimes, that's California, because they tend to be at the forefront of a lot of employment litigation. And so when there are going to be new policies coming about, they're almost guided by, well, what's California doing? What are employers in California doing? And then how can we trickle that down through to all of our various offices, to our employees, statewide. So what I've been seeing most recently, pre-COVID, was just around what do we do to make sure that all of our policies are compliant, to make sure that we're creating sort of an equitable workplace for our employees, whether they work in California, New York, Florida, Texas, and bringing it up to not just the standards of the location that you're, live in, but also the standards nationwide.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's interesting, and I always enjoy talking to employment lawyers, because the fact patterns in the client are always some of the fun ones, right, and interesting ones.
Oh, absolutely. Like, when I actually joke now with my friends who are labor and employment attorneys as to why they let me just do straight commercial litigation for so long, knowing how much I love the drama of labor and employment. Like, I mean, sometimes you can't even make this stuff up, and that's not to say that there are some really serious issues that we face.
Of course, yes, not to make light of any of those. Yeah.
Not to sort of make light, but sometimes you just kind of have to make light of some of the situations, because you can get really jaded, and also you're dealing with people. Once you're dealing with people, you're going to have like off the cuff craziness go down. So it's been an interesting past couple of years. I'll just say that, in terms of the fact patterns that I've dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then I guess too, and we had over the, I guess, late spring and summer, right? The Supreme Court case on civil rights and Title VII, and that I imagine will start to play into some of your clients as well, huh?
And what's interesting that I've seen, especially with my nationwide clients, is they were already at the forefront of doing it. So the Supreme Court made it so that this is now the law across the country. But some states had laws in place that already provided protections to members of the LGBTQ community. Yeah, and so most of the employers I was working with, if you worked in Texas, just like you would have the protection in, California or Illinois or New York, they were giving you those protections as well.
Right.
So that's one of the things, and not to get political here, but at the end of the day, Supreme Court nominees, that affects the practice that I'm in, because a lot of the work that I do is federal laws.
Yeah.
What my hope is that employers have already been doing the right thing in terms of putting policies in place that protect various employees, regardless of whether that's absolutely required or not, regardless of whether it applies nationwide or not. So my hope is that when the Supreme Court, when the demographics of the Supreme Court change such that, there's almost this fear that certain groups of people aren't going to get the same protections, my hope is employers aren't going to roll back protections that were already in place because it's no longer required. If you're already doing it, it's already in your policies. You're not going to take it out because the Supreme Court says you don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. And that gets into, I'm sure, PR issues as well. And that would not be a good look.
Exactly. I mean, how do you say for 3 years, we were offering protections to women and minorities and members of the LGBTQ community, but the Supreme Court says we don't have to do it anymore. So
now we can't.
Exactly.
Probably not heading in that direction. Well, interesting. And then as it relates to COVID, what has been the impact on your clients and some of the issues you've been working through with them within the employment space as it relates to COVID?
Sure. So COVID-19 has made it so that there are probably more people working remotely or in some sort of hybrid work from home on a couple of days, work from the office from a couple of days kind of situation. And that in and of itself creates its own issues. It creates opportunities, it creates issues, right? So you have opportunities around people being able to have a more flexible workday. So for example, now that we have students that are back in school, your traditional workday is not going to be 9 to 5 anymore, because if you're at home and your child is at home working virtually as well, it can't be expected that you're at your desk from 9 to 5. Like, that's not even practical. And for most employees, their boss and their boss's boss are also going to be going through something similar to that, which means that we're almost changing the face of what does the workday look like. Now, the flip of that, though, is if there's no standard around what the workday looks like, then you have issues around, well, what is your performance? Because we're no longer looking person to person. You're all here at the same times working on similar things. So your performance looks like this, and I could match it up to, this other person's performance. There are challenges around team integration, right? Like, we're all trying to do as many Zoom calls and get virtual interaction as much as we can. But if I can't, get a hold of you because you're dealing with childcare issues, which is absolutely valid, then you have issues around, well, how do I know that this work is getting done? How can I keep track of your performance? So, and then of course, the myriad wage hour issues that can come around from, are you working off the clock? How can I, make sure that you're tracking all of your time? Are you entitled to reimbursement for the business expenses that you're incurring while you're working from home? Now, not just your internet access is no longer just for leisure. This is internet access for, work on the weekends, potentially. So there are going to be, we've already seen litigation around COVID-19 where the lawyers are getting pretty creative in sort of tacking on COVID-19 as one of the bases for why they're bringing their lawsuit that they probably otherwise would have brought anyway. Right. But it's like, here's a COVID-19 angle to it as well.
Another ornament to hang on the tree.
Exactly. I was doing we have a couple webinars coming up for employers. And so I'm doing a litigation update with one of the partners at my firm. And so I was just, going through from last count, I think there are about 800 cases that my firm has tracked with COVID-19 in the language. So some I would just randomly select and choose. And it would be, your website is not accessible, which accessibility cases have been around for a while now. That has, technically nothing to do with COVID-19. Well, now it does, because if I need to wear a mask to go into your store and I potentially have an issue that makes it, according to me and my lawyer, that makes it so I can't wear a mask, and now your website is also not accessible, boom, right. There's your ADA lawsuit, right? So right. They're sort of enhanced because of COVID-19.
Yeah. Wow. So many new issues, but like you said, not a new issue, but just a now COVID angle.
That's exactly right. COVID angle issue to your already determined case that you were probably going to file anyway. Yeah. Then, as you'd mentioned too, you do have some novel issues, right? Like, we have issues around new paid sick leave laws.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. How do you work that into your system before? How you have to make sure that if you fall under some of these new paid sick leave laws, that your managers are trained on those issues so they know how to respond appropriately. We have issues around, potential xenophobia relating to, if you're calling it the China flu or the China plague, right? Like, people of certain ethnicities may be offended by that. And so making sure that even in the midst of sort of this changing landscape, that you are keeping your managers and your employee apprised of appropriate behavior generally, and also here are the new standards that you have to comply with.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I should have mentioned before we started the COVID conversation, just for reference, people listening later, that we're recording this October 1st. And I always like to do that just because there are so many things that change with this week over week, that what we're saying today may be different when people listen to this, and for sure if they're listening to it much later. So I want to give context to that. But in terms of how you and your firm have been just carrying on your practice and your work, what has that been like in the last few weeks? I assume that much like most of us, we went through kind of the initial shutdown in March, April, and then everybody's kind of based off where they live and where they work in cities. And, it's kind of been a different story in terms of kind of reopening and reworking. So what's it been like for you all?
Oh, sure. So My firm, shut down in March, but we all just sort of switched to remote. We're currently in a system where if you want to go into the office, you can. And I think for the Houston office, there's like a 25% capacity because the nature of the space and the layout makes it so we can pretty much social distance pretty easily there. And then we, redesigned some of the spaces so that everybody has an office. Some of our other offices don't really so feasibly allow for that. And so if you want to go in, you kind of have to get permission, which ultimately makes it so we're still working for the most part remotely, which I'm recently learning is, I guess, not as standard for some other places in that, back in May or June, they were kind of told, hey, it's time for you to start coming back. We haven't had that conversation. It's been, if you want to come in, great, you're welcome to, if, we can make it work. If you are getting your work done and you're working remotely and nobody has to keep tabs on you and you're kind of working on your team or working on your projects as you need to, keep doing that. We'll keep you posted on any changes.
And in terms of any cases or things that you've been dealing with within the court system, hearings, all of that, have you had some of those by video, by Zoom, by other technologies, or kind of what's been the status of that?
So several of my cases are sort of in a holding pattern where, cases that were filed pre-pandemic announcement, employers are like, we're not trying to spend money on that. We have to spend money on all these other new things.
Yes.
So no. To the extent that they were far enough along. So I've taken a couple depositions by Zoom, which I'll say this, I didn't hate, you lose the element of being in the room, which I think there's a person-to-personness about that is hard to replicate via video chat. That said, it happened smoother than I anticipated.
Good.
Perhaps it's, an age thing, but I was happy to just, swing the document up on Zoom, have the, witness see it, be able to play around in it, and then I still had full control over it, so you can sort of control the timing of things. In an in-person deposition, you give them a document, 15 minutes later, they might still be flipping through it. On Zoom, I'm doing the scrolling and asking you if you need to see it anymore. So, little things like that, I actually really enjoyed. Plus, it's from the comfort of your own home, which can't beat that. A couple issues with the dogs barking and stuff, but
I know.
Once we got over that, I actually didn't mind. And then I've had a couple hearings, telephonic hearings that again went fine. So I'm not concerned if we stay in this situation a little bit longer. Now, trial, eventually that we're going to have to figure out how to do jury trials safely, how we make people feel as though they are safe. And then we already have a system where people don't respond to jury summons anyway. So how do we, get them to respond to a jury summons and feel safe that they're going to, and when they show up, that they know they're going to be kept safe. So that will be the next issue we're going to have to address, I think, in the legal profession. Anybody who's a litigator is going to have to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. And I think saw maybe for sure this week, yesterday, day before, here in Waco, that jury summons were going out for McLennan County for trials, I assume next month or something like that. And so I guess we're going to see how this all works. I don't know.
There's been some jury trials in Harris County. A friend of mine was actually telling me about a case, sort of without getting into too much details, where I think they were planning to try to do it at NRG. And so they can get all the people sort of distanced enough to keep trial going. Of course, you can pull off a non-jury trial. I think that works as well. It's the bigger issue is going to be how do we get folks to show up in response to a summons? Right.
No, absolutely. Well, good. Well, I want to transition and ask you a couple of things regarding race, with race in the law, race in our current environment. We've talked about it on the show a number of times, really since May, and the George Floyd situation is since then. But I appreciate your thoughts on some of these topics, and would want to let you kind of share some of your thoughts on this. And the first question I've got for you is just how, in general, maybe the legal system is handling issues around race and ensuring that there is equal treatment under the law, regardless of race.
The legal profession doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so when you acknowledge that there's systemic racism, then the systemic racism that exists necessarily sort of trickles down into the justice system. So yeah. I think we're all sort of coming to terms with, like, one, the fact that the phrase systemic racism is top of mind for most Americans now is huge. I don't think a year or two ago, if you said systemic racism, most people who weren't people of color would have any idea what you're talking about, nor would they necessarily agree, because it's scary to acknowledge the fact that you live in a country where people who have a certain skin color are not given the same opportunities. They are targeted. They're less safe. People want to believe that in a country like America, where everyone can survive, and not just survive, but thrive, there's no way that could be happening here.
Right.
Well, we're acknowledging, like, that's just not true. And even if you're given the same opportunities, if you're a certain race, you still have barriers that are invisible for you to overcome, like your name, right? Like, we're seeing issues around, if you have a certain sounding name, you may not get, certain opportunities because people's default is just, I don't want to deal with something that's different. So to go back to your question about the legal profession, for as long as America's been around, there have been injustices in the legal system as it relates to people of color, and whether they're given, whether they're treated fairly, whether the trial that they're given is fair, whether they have access to counsel that's competent, whether the jury that hears their issue, views them from a certain light, and so doesn't give them, the same benefit of the doubt that potentially a white person in America might get. So, I'm cautiously somewhat hopeful around the fact that these conversations are happening so widely, so that when you see gross miscarriages of justice, we're all seeing it now playing out in the media. We're seeing it playing out on the news, where a couple of years ago, a Breonna Taylor type of situation, those of us who aren't lawyers wouldn't really care, because that kind of stuff it doesn't affect you on an individual level. So you might see it if you're really into the news, it might hit your radar, and then you'd kind of go on. Now you have everyday people, like my husband, who's not a lawyer, who's like, is it weird for a grand juror to file a lawsuit to get grand jury information released? And I'm like, yeah, that's new. That doesn't really happen, right?
Right.
He's now engaged in terms of, well, tell me what that means. What's the impact of that on the case? What's the effect? And I think everyday Americans are really in tune with what's the impact of, the attorney general deciding not to bring certain charges. And that's not to weigh in on the decision one way or the other. It's just more people are engaged, and that is how change happens. Because if everything stays the same when no one's paying attention, it's hard for it to stay the same when people are paying attention and they're outraged by it, because they're going to want to see change. They're going to demand change, and, change comes, plug here, register to vote. Change comes by,
sure.
Paying attention, voting, by staying apprised of what's going on and making sure that your voice is heard in whatever community that you're in. If these issues, not just if these issues affect you personally, but if you have a problem with what you're seeing, it's not just that you have no say, because you actually do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. If you're looking maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and able to kind of now look back on the months here in 2020 when this kind of erupted in a new way, in a fresh way. I mean, this happens every so often. We had Michael Brown in Ferguson 4 or 5 years ago. It happens. This has been a little bit more stayed here over these last few months. But if you look at 2-3 years from now, and if you're sitting there looking back, what do you think are some things that you're either concerned about and also hopeful about that would put us in either a different place there, hopefully better place, 2-3 years from now, versus either in the same place or worse? What are some things on either side of that?
I'm always concerned, like you said, these things happen every couple of years. We all get mad about it, we tweet about it, and then life happens and we move on from it.
Yeah,
I genuinely believe that had we not been in a pandemic, we were all sort of consuming information nonstop because that's how our anxiety is helping us cope, we also would have moved on from a lot of these issues. I mean, there was no body cam, video in some of these issues that have happened in the past couple months. And especially when that happens, everybody forgets about it. Yet there's been staying power because we have nothing else to focus on. So my concern, less so than typically, is we just forget, right? Like you're angry for a little while and then you feel as though there's nothing you can do. And so you move on with the next issue that you're dealing with in your life. I've been seeing conversations from people who, again, not as engaged as, some people who like the news more, who really are just, engaged, who are like, tell me more about what it is I can do beyond just voting in a presidential election. Like, what can I actually do? Without, seeing the statistics on this, I'm willing to say that more people have written a letter to their representative in 2020 than they've ever done before in their life. I'm willing to say that more people have, engaged in the quote unquote political process, in that they have, whether it's through Twitter, whether it's through letters, people are like, tell me how I can save the postal service. Like, these are issues that you're like, 5 years ago, no one would have talked about any of this. So my hope is it sticks. My hope is this is not it's a big election year, so we're all, feeling like we have to do something. Even in non-election years, right? Like, do you know who is on your city council? Because it's your city council that's going to be making decisions around what your school looks like, what your police force looks like, what local issues that you're dealing with, the effect of that. That's who really has the power sort of in your day-to-day life. So the staying power around, it's more than just the presidency. It's more than just Supreme Court justices. It's all of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the things, and I'd be curious if you either agree or disagree with this, and I totally can see that either way. Sure. But I feel like one of the things, at least for me, that has been a little bit of a struggle, and I feel like I'm pretty plugged in and listening and reading and all that. I think one of the things that's a struggle is to the sort of along the lines of what you were just saying in terms of beyond kind of presidency, Supreme Court, but really getting into a little bit more of the, practical details, because I think one of the things that's hard is, okay, what actual policies, what actual changes, specific changes do we feel like would be appropriate, would be helpful? I think body cams, we talked about that or earlier, is one that gets tossed around a lot. And that's a specific one. And I think a lot of police departments have moved on that. Not everyone, but a lot. And although I feel like every now and then we still see these things pop up and they weren't wearing their body cams. I'm not sure what's happening with that. But that's definitely one. But beyond that, I mean, I think that's been a challenge for me, honestly, is to kind of figure out and think through and look through, okay, what are the, 4 or 5, what are the kind of Bill of Rights style things for this issue, for this topic, that everybody could rally behind and put, like when they write to their legislators, what are they writing for them to do? Care about this, read the books or whatever, but like, okay, but pass X, get up there and reject Y, what, I mean, so I think that's at least for me, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's one of the things I know I've been struggling with.
For sure. So, the conversation that I've been having around these issues, I think people like grand ideas. You want to see a big thing go down so you can say, major change happened because I did this thing. Yeah. But we neglect sort of the everyday potential impact that you can have. So, for example, you are in a position in your workplace where you get to speak up for somebody, anybody. Using that opportunity to speak up for marginalized people in your workplace. You are in a position where you are a teacher. And you know that virtual learning has a disproportionate effect depending on the socioeconomic class of your students. Using your position in whatever way you can, right? Like, I already know teachers are, I saw the funniest meme after the election where it's like, if Chris, if the moderator's performance didn't show you that kindergarten teachers are underpaid, nothing will convince you, right? And I was like, no, but really though, how do you control when two people are just screaming at you?
Yes.
And so using whatever influence you have sort of in the situation that you're in goes as far as writing a letter to your senator, right? Like you can only do so much in terms of creating policy.
Sure.
A lot of us, if millions of us send letters, maybe change happens. You're more likely to see change happen in your individual decisions that you make. You see someone being talked over or spoken over in a meeting. You correct that. You hear an idea and it's attributed to someone else, and you know that idea shouldn't be attributed to that person. It should be attributed to somebody else. Speak up. Use the influence that you have. One, identify what your influence is, because we all have influence. I have influence in my workplace and I'm an associate. Sure. I know who I can speak up on behalf of. I know who I can advocate to. The higher up you go, the more that exists. And so this idea around, and I think, sort of the word that we're using now is allyship. And everybody wants to know, how can I be an ally? How can I be a better ally? Well, look at your individual daily interactions. Look who you're interacting with and see what changes you can make around that. Yeah. That's sort of my simple answer, I guess.
Yeah. That's great. As far as how lawyers who are our audience, how they can use their not just kind of sphere of influence, but also their actual skills and abilities and license to affect change or to get involved in something, are there things that you would raise as opportunities for lawyers if they say, hey, I do commercial litigation, or I do this, or I do that. But is there something, whether it's maybe in a pro bono effort, or maybe it's in a career shift, or maybe it's just in a community setting, but what are some things that you would suggest for lawyers to use their skills and abilities on this?
Absolutely. I mean, there's myriad opportunities, I think, for lawyers, right? For example, my firm and several firms that I've read of and I've looked into have created initiatives that focus on minority-owned businesses. So for Vorys, it's called the Vorys Initiative for Business Empowerment. What that does is it creates a firm-sanctioned pro bono program where we specifically offer legal services to minority-owned businesses. Because systemic racism continues when people don't have access and when people are kept financially under, ultimately. There have been statistics that show that minority-owned businesses don't get off the ground at the same level as non-minority-owned businesses because they don't put the same protections in place, like I'm going to, trademark my whatever. I'm going to, ensure that this, I can use this name. I'm going to ensure that whatever it is.
Right.
Because it's more expensive for you to put safeguards in place than to just sort of go forth, create the business, and hope that nothing bad happens.
Right.
So what we did, and what I've seen several other firms do, is offer pro bono services to businesses starting out, to start up minority-owned businesses, or to establish minority-owned businesses who have that need legal services, and if they're below a certain threshold in terms of their gross revenues for the year, it makes it so it's a great pro bono effort. And that's something that, regardless of the size of your firm, like if you're a larger law firm, I think it's way easier for you to create something like that because you already have a pro bono committee. Just make that a part of it. If you're a smaller law firm, at least, in larger cities, I even count Waco as sort of one of the big cities in Texas.
Thank you.
You have it's not a tiny town. It's a city.
Sure.
It's a city. You have volunteer legal services.
Yeah.
I heard a lawyer one time say, if you have time to get your nails done and you have time to get your hair done, you have time to give back. And that always stuck with me because we can always say we don't have time, but we make time for the things that we care about. And so whether it's an hour that you're doing, legal services on a Saturday, or it's 7 a.m., before your, kids are going off to school or whatever it is, finding an hour to do something that gives back and that uses your, legal skills. I'm not going to take on, a tax case but I may review somebody's employment agreement, right? Like that's finding whatever your skill set is, right, and seeing if there's a volunteer opportunity for you to do that so that it advances, people who are underrepresented or who don't have as much access as we do.
Yeah, that's great. And the last thing on this, and we'll be out of time. So I like that we have, I think, devoted this episode to this topic, and I think it's worthy and important, and I'm glad we have. The last thing is within the law firm world, within the legal profession. I know it's always, and it seemed like more recently too, been an initiative among especially large law firms, but in the industry as a whole, to create more opportunities and try to make a way more for minorities and people of color to have careers within the legal space. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that. How has that been successful? What are the challenges? I know coming from the law school environment, which is really the pipeline creator for everyone to get into the legal profession and to a law firm, that was always an issue as well at the admissions stage, was trying to do that as well. So what are some thoughts on that topic?
Sure. I think the easy, and this will probably get me in some trouble, I think the easy step that firms have taken is recruitment. That is the easiest thing you could do. Find people, minorities, members of the LGBTQ community, hire them. That's the easiest thing you could do. When they're in your organization, are they actually being treated fairly? Is their experience equitable? Are they getting access to the same work? Or is it that you've now brought them into somewhat of a hostile environment, and it may not be overtly hostile, but if you're looking at what your colleagues are working on and you're looking at what you are working on, if you are looking at the opportunities, the growth opportunities in particular that your colleagues are working on, and you're not getting those same growth opportunities, if your work is not being evaluated at the same level as other people, if you are not given the same benefit of the doubt that your white colleagues are getting, if someone may get the opportunity to not be present, and in response to that, you say they're having a life situation and we give them some grace, versus this other person who it's just laziness, right? Like, how are you analyzing the behaviors of the people that you've now brought into your organization? Because it's about retention. I think the numbers, they can be better for recruitment. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but we're doing better in terms of recruitment.
Okay.
The issue is retention. The issue is, are people of color crossing the finish line towards becoming a partner? Right. Equity partner numbers are, we can agree they're abysmal. Yeah. And that's because we're just not given the same opportunities. And as long as firms sort of continue to do the same thing that they've always done, or I'll say create programs, which I put in air quotes, this is a podcast, you won't see it, but you create these quote unquote programs without the real impact to them. And by that, I mean, are you speaking up? If you are in a position, and I said this sort of briefly earlier, if you are in a position where you can speak up on someone's behalf, are you doing it? If you're in a position where you can mentor or sponsor a person of color who you have worked with, are you doing it? If you are in a position where you don't know a single person of color at your firm and you're on management committee, have you taken the effort to do so? Because we're going to look around and say, it feels as though we don't exist and we're going to leave, which is what has been happening. And I say we, I'm not talking about we, Akilah Craig. My firm, I think, is doing as much as they can and really having good conversations around these issues. We had we had 2 racial equity town halls where conversations that I would never have believed would ever happen at a law firm were happening around anti-racism and around systemic racism in this country. Yeah. And then in light of that, while there have been programs that have put in place, there have also just been real conversations that I've been having with partners that I don't think would have happened but for sort of a 2020 eruption of all of these. So it's being open to having these uncomfortable conversations and then again, in your individual spaces, whether you're a partner, whether you're on management, whether you have a giant book of business and you're deciding who you're giving your work to, whether you have a small book of business and you're deciding which, associate are you going to ask to help you on these things.
Yeah.
These are all really everyday decisions that impact the effect that all of us associates are going to have at the workplace. But particularly when you're a person of color and you're passed over for these opportunities, it makes it so that the legal profession is inequitable. So putting systems in place to ensure that, that's not happening anymore.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you said that, because I do think everything or most of the things I hear on this topic are regarding recruitment and kind of the front door, the retention piece and kind of what's happening once the person is there, the people are there. That is not much of the topic of conversation I hear. So I'm so glad
it's harder.
That's the hard part.
Exactly. It's a lot harder once you have somebody in to be like, and now how do I shape your experience? Yeah. And that's not to say, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, but that's not to say like you as an individual associate have a lot to play in the experience that you have as well. So the default is you're doing great work, you are showing up, you are available, and all of these things are happening. Like there have been studies that show that Black women are some of the hungriest employees you're going to have. So how about we set aside our stereotypes around Black women and we just give them the same opportunities that we're giving to everyone else? I think we'll see that the legal profession will benefit from it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing on all those thoughts and topics. I really appreciate it. And I think it's beneficial to continue to have these conversations and to keep moving this ball forward. So thank you for that. We've got some rapid fire questions to end our time with, if you're set for that. Since we didn't get to the topic today of which we often cover in recruitment and associate life and all that stuff, this first question will be a good one for you to hit that point on our way out the door here. Name the one trait or characteristic you most want to see in an associate.
I want to see somebody who is willing to take on an opportunity they've never done before, even if it means maybe failing at it, but it's because they took a chance so that now they can grow from it.
Cool. I like that one. What habit has been key to your success?
Probably failing up. It's probably why it's my favorite characteristic in is take it on hard stuff, right? Like, hey, go take this deposition. I'm sorry. What? Okay. I'm going to read all the books I can and figure out how to do that.
I love that. Your favorite app or productivity tool?
This is unpopular opinion. iTimekeeper has been a lifesaver for me. I was the worst when it came to entering time. My secretaries can all attest to that. And now, at the end of the month, my time is usually done. It took me 15 minutes to finish up my time today. So, iTimekeeper.
iTimekeeper. Awesome.
Yes.
No, that's a big one. I know people struggle with it. It's not natural.
Timekeeping is the worst. It's the bane of every defense attorney's existence. I swear by iTimekeeper.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good one. Your favorite social distancing activity?
Are there activities in quarantine? What's an activity?
They usually involve alcohol and walks around the block, but you can come up with something else.
We have been going on little trips around Texas. And so just finding really remote towns that I probably never would have gone to.
Yeah.
And social distancing away from the city.
Yeah. Have you found a favorite spot so far in that tour?
We were in Hunt, Texas a couple weeks ago, and that was probably one of the cool. I mean, it was my small group of us, 6 of us, found this really great house in Hunt, Texas, sitting on acres and acres of land, and we just cooked and swam and ate outside and did all of that stuff. It was really relaxing and amazing.
Okay. Well, I'm not sharing that with anyone else listening, but I'm going to ask you to send me the link to that on Airbnb or something, wherever you found it later.
Absolutely.
I think that's something we've been talking about.
It was great.
Your favorite legal movie? Last one.
I don't really really love legal movies because I am too critical of litigation. And I'm always like, that's not how a deposition would be taken. But if I had to pick one, I would say Just Mercy with Michael B. Jordan.
Yes, that's a good one. We watched it. Oh, it was maybe 2 months ago now. But it's a great movie. Michael B. Jordan's the best, and
Michael B. Jordan's the best.
Yes, so that's a good one, and I appreciate that. Well, Akilah, thank you again so much for taking the time. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for letting me have this candid, somewhat scary conversation with you around some of the topics we discussed.
Anytime, and we can hope you'll come back. We'll do it again. Hopefully when there's progress made, we can talk about 6 months, 12 months from now. It'd be great.
Works for me.
All right. My thanks again to Akilah Craig for joining us on the show. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider doing 2 things? Would you subscribe so you don't miss an episode? And then would you rate and review the podcast in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts? Let's see how many times I can say podcasts in one paragraph. If you have suggestions or thoughts about the show, or if I could help you in any way, please email me, daniel@varsitysearch.com. Also, don't forget, if you or someone you know might be interested in any of the law firm opportunities that we're currently working with, you can email me or go to varsitysearch.com/lawyers. All right, that's it for today's episode of Lone Star Lawyers. Thanks again so much to each of you for listening. I'm Daniel Hare with Varsity Search, and we'll talk with you next time.